Morning, everyone. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum. Welcome to another of our virtual Art in Focus events. I'm once again borrowing the museum director's office, in part because today I have a special guest with me in the room, and that is the object that we are going to be talking about, mostly using virtual imagery, but it's always nice to be reminded of the physical reality of our art objects. Whoops, as I drop it. So this is don't worry, very sturdy piece of watercolor paper with Sears Gallagher's Bedouin warrior on it from probably the late 19th century. Those you'll see with our caption, we don't have a date associated with it in our files. The color will not show up perfectly on the Zoom screen, so as I put this down, our wonderful producer is going to transfer us to the PowerPoint slide. But again, I like to have a sense of objects as physical objects. That's where Art in Focus started, gathered in the gallery to talk about one physical art object as a group. And that is the experience that we are really looking forward to revisiting as we move into spring 2022. We'll be announcing our spring calendar shortly, but I can say that one of the things we're planning on doing with regard to Art in Focus in response to some of the feedback we've received from those who are both looking to come back to the gallery, but also those who don't live locally and would like to continue to engage with these Art in Focus events. We are going to be offering every Art in Focus in the spring twice. We'll offer it once as a virtual experience, and we will offer it on a separate date as an in-person only experience in the gallery. So you can just keep that in mind and wait for us to unveil what will be the subject of our Art in Focus events in spring 2022. But for now, we can turn to the PowerPoint and see an image of our Sears Gallagher watercolor. You're seeing it there on screen. So Sears Gallagher was an American artist born in 1869. He died in 1955. He spent most of his life in the Boston area, and he was a prolific artist, a painter, watercolorist, etcher. The object that we're talking about today is a watercolor. So that's why I mentioned, as I fumbled it there for a second, that it's very nice, thick watercolor paper. If you've done watercolors, you'll probably be able to envision that sort of tactile experience. And it was a gift along with about 30 other art objects from the artist's granddaughter. So we are very fortunate to have a number of Sears Gallagher's works here at Fairfield University. And when we accepted the gift last year, and the museum director and I were looking through the watercolors and etchings that had arrived, we were both immediately captivated by the Bedouin warrior. Just the extraordinary, the depth of color, which I think, as I said, is not as visible in me holding up the object in front of you, and I hope is coming through on the slide, because as I'm looking down at lying in front of me, the richness of the blue behind the seated man is really wonderful to look at. It's just the barest indication of shadow, of depth, and it's echoed in this wonderful blue line of edging around his robe. So just in pure terms of color, my eyes were immediately drawn to it. And also just in terms of subject matter. So we have a seated man wearing a turban that's been wrapped around with a band of a dark brown material. He's wearing a striped, multicolored piece of fabric, almost like a cloak, that seems to be wrapped around a piece that's stretching across his chest. He's wearing what seems to be sort of cream-colored caftan-style robe. We see a hint maybe around the waist of an orange sash. We can see footwear. We might assume boots. And then we really have very little understanding of what he's sitting on. But of course, the other thing that draws the eye is that he has this very long rifle, this gun that is held in his hands. It's lying on his lap, and he's looking off in perfect profile with reference to us. So no indication that this man is taking any notice of our existence. He is focused on something out of the frame. So as I said, as we looked at these objects that have been gifted to the museum in 2020, both the museum director, Carrie, and I were really drawn to this watercolor for the richness of the color and for the subject matter. We noticed that it was not similar to most of the other artworks that we had both received from the artist's granddaughter and indeed many of the other artworks that if you look up Sears Gallagher online, you will find quite a lot of information about him. You'll find many examples of his artwork, and you won't find that many that look like this. So, of course, we're always interested in something that captures us visually, but also something that maybe twinges the imagination. Under what circumstances does an artist born in 1869 in the United States come to be creating a watercolor of a seated Bedouin warrior holding his long rifle? What was the function of an artist, of an object like this? So wondering those questions about a potential context, a potential reason for an artwork like this really got our minds working, and that's one of the reasons that we decided to feature it in Art in Focus today. To give you a little bit of a sense of what you can see, if you visit our website, if you go to embark.fairfield.edu, that's the URL on screen, you can browse all of the Sears Gallagher pieces that we received from the artist's granddaughter as a gift last year. And even just through these very small thumbnails, you're seeing some watercolors, you're seeing a whole slew of etchings. You might immediately notice the lack of other subjects that seem to match the Bedouin warrior watercolor that we're talking about. So we didn't see, in looking at Sears Gallagher's output, we didn't see a lot of other artwork like this, which, as I said, tweaked our curiosity a little. We love the other work that is in our collection now through his granddaughter's generous gift. And I just want to highlight as an example of his etching work, which is something he was particularly well known for during his life, during his career, is his great skill with etching, is that one of the wonderful aspects of this gift, we are a teaching museum, we are an academic art museum, and along with these two etchings, the Sisters on the left and Salt Hay on the right. Sisters is fairly small, it's about this big. Salt Hay is significantly larger. We also received a gift of the etching plates, the original uncanceled metal sheets from which these prints were drawn. So as a teaching tool, that is really unparalleled. And I include them in the slideshow today because it just so happened last week I was teaching my students, were talking about Japanese woodblock prints. So we got into talking about other forms of printmaking, intaglio printmaking, and how wonderful to be able to bring into the classroom these two physical etchings and then the plates with which they were produced. So we're so grateful to the artist's granddaughter for presenting this wonderful gift to our museum. We're also grateful to Sears Gallagher, who chose not to cancel the plates. He didn't sort of scratch an X through them. So they are a wonderful teaching tool to see how the marks left in a metal plate translate to an art object produced through the printmaking process. But of course I digress, because our Sears Gallagher work of the day is a watercolor. It's not an etching. As I said, we have a number now of Gallagher watercolors in our collection, and none, as I say, just a little bit like this. So as we looked to find more information about Sears Gallagher, about his training and his career, he followed in many ways the kind of academic art training that you would expect of someone who came of age in the late 19th century in the United States. He sought art training in the Boston area with a number of different artists, including one who was from Italy. And in 1895, after he had gotten married, he went off to Europe, and he followed in the grand tradition of academic art by enrolling in an art academy in Paris. And the academy that he enrolled in is called the Académie Julian, and he was there from 1895 to 1896. And I like this painting because it's made by another American artist, and it is held here in Connecticut at the Benton at the University of Connecticut. So this is a painting from about 10 years after Sears Gallagher would have been at this painting academy in Paris, but it's giving you a really good sense of what that physical environment would have been like. We see men seated at easels, some are on stools, some are sort of almost look like they're crouched on the ground because their stools are so low, and they're all gathered around a life drawing subject. So there's a live female model, nude, on an elevated stage, and every one of the men gathered here is drawing or painting her. So this was academic art training. This is the kind of training that someone like Sears Gallagher would have received, learning to draw, to sketch, and to paint from life subjects. And I will mention that the Académie Julian was pretty progressive for its day. Starting in the 1880s, they actually allowed women students, which none of the other fine art academies in Europe were doing at the time. But you're not seeing any female students in this image, even though it's from 1905, because they still physically segregated men and women, especially with life drawing. So there's some irony there. And although there is a nude woman at all which all of these men are looking, no clothed female students are allowed to share the same space with them. You can find some other images of the female students of this painting academy that are available online. It's sort of a fascinating glimpse into the history of art training in Europe in the 19th century as it moved toward a more complete integration of men and women. But at the time that Sears Gallagher would have been in Paris, it's late 19th century Paris, 1895. I mean, this would have been an exciting and electric time, I think, to be in Paris, to be an art student. And it just so happens that where our watercolor of the Bedouin warrior might fit into Sears Gallagher's story might have to do with his time in Paris. And the reason we suggest that is because one of the teachers that he enrolled with at the Académie Julian was this artist, whose last name is Benjamin Constant. We featured this lithograph in a different Art in Focus a couple of years ago. It was also in one of our exhibitions 2 or 3 years ago. Time, as we know, has sort of begun to lose its meaning. But when I was reading about Sears Gallagher and I saw, oh, he enrolled in the atelier of Jean-Joseph Benjamin Constant, I was like, why do I know that name? Of course, we have this fantastic lithograph, A Jew of Tangier, which when we talked about it in our Art in Focus, we talked about the concept of Orientalism, which was really all the rage in late 19th century Paris. The idea of the world beyond Europe as a place of exoticism, of fancy, but without an interest in understanding it on its own terms. Orientalism, as a term that art historians use, always refers to Europeans, North Americans, looking to what they called, quote unquote, the East, as a place that was fascinating, but also remote and distinctly less civilized, less developed than they themselves considered themselves to be. So, in as much as they were fascinated by the Middle East, by North Africa, they were always looking at it from a position of, they felt, cultural superiority, which did not stop them from making Orientalist subjects a hugely popular genre of academic art training and academic art production. So here we have an example from our museum's collection, A Jew of Tangier. So we're looking at someone purportedly a native of Morocco. And this would have been someone that Sears Gallagher studied with. So when we put those pieces together, we say, okay, we have this watercolor by Sears Gallagher of a man in very elaborate North African garb with his rifle seated. No evidence to suggest that Sears Gallagher himself ever traveled to Morocco or anywhere in North Africa or the Middle East. We know he traveled through Europe. We have a number of his etchings of the city of Venice, for example. But he certainly didn't encounter a Bedouin in Boston, and he may not even have encountered one in Paris. This might have been someone dressed up as a Bedouin warrior. But one of our best guesses for the context in which this object could have been produced would have been in the atelier, in the studio workshop, as aspiring artists are being trained to look at a live figure in front of them and produce drawings in watercolors. Knowing that one of his teachers shared this very common fascination for Orientalism, it doesn't seem out of the question that this scene could have been a work that he produced during his time as a student in Paris. However, I want to state very clearly that that is entirely a supposition on our part. This could well have been created after his return to the United States. It could have been created later in life off a memory or an idea. But just thinking in terms of where did this American artist come from? He is coming of age in the 1890s. He's traveling to Paris to seek out the very traditional form of art education in the academies. This is the kind of training that he would have been given. And this is the kind of taste for exotic subject matter that was all the rage in Europe at the time. So the pieces make sense. but I don't want to suggest that we have, dotted all of the I's and crossed the T's, because as with so many things in art history, I don't think we will ever have a full and complete answer. While I was preparing for Art in Focus today, I was looking at other resources on Sears Gallagher's work and looking to see if there were other examples of similarly, quote unquote, Orientalist watercolors, or indeed etchings, or any other material that would share a common theme with the watercolor that we're looking at here. And I didn't find any that are exactly like our friend here. But one thing that I did come across were, these are from auction websites. These are pieces that have been sold. So they're not in museum or library collections, but they are two illustrations, both of which are copyrighted at the bottom, 1899. And both of them clearly follow an Orientalist theme. So on the left, we see the face of a dark-skinned man with a beard, with a white turban, just a glimpse of blue across his forehead. We see in profile a camel with a very elaborate bridle and the sort of ghostly image of two pyramids floating in the distance. And on the right, we see a woman reclining on a series of cushions. We see palm fronds around her. We have a very generic sense of setting, but there is a sense of the exotic, a sense of the quote unquote Orient that characterizes artwork that we call Orientalist. In her case, the fact that she's holding a cigarette in her hand is the clue that this is an illustration for an advertisement. And in fact, both of these were illustrations for advertisements. That was one way that Sears Gallagher made a living. He turned his incredible talent toward producing illustrations that were often used in advertisements. And you'll see that both of these are signed. Both of these illustrations are signed lower left with the man with the camel, lower right with the reclining woman. But ours is not signed. It is not, doesn't have a copyright. It is not a reproduction for an illustration. So our object is the physical watercolor paper on which Sears Gallagher, with his brush, applies these blues and oranges and creams and browns and produces this very striking image. And since I just showed the tobacco illustration with the very dark-skinned man facing us, we can see here in contrast that we're looking at someone who is Caucasian, perhaps North African, but of Arab descent, who is not does not have black skin. So this could very well be, as I suggested, this could have been a model. This man could have been French, or perhaps he was, in fact, a native of North Africa living in Paris who worked as a model for one of the academies. As I say, there will always be so many questions that we don't know, but I think it's a fantastic object, and it's a beautiful object to look at. And really, we wonder, what is he thinking about? Whether it's the Bedouin warrior, quote unquote, that this image purports to depict, or if we imagine this just being a studio model. He is holding this pose, seated in profile, holding the gun, keeping his features and his body still so that a group of men in this atelier can sketch him, can do watercolors of him. I've never worked as a life model, but I would love to know what's going through his mind. Some of you may have thoughts on anything that I have shared today, or questions. Please feel free to put those in the chat if you're watching live on thequicklive.com. If you have other questions that come to mind, or other information that you might want to share with us, we are always excited to hear from folks who might have more information about objects in our collections. If you have something of Sears Gallagher's that you'd like to share, please send us an email. You can email us at museum@fairfield.edu with any questions or comments. And since there don't seem to be any live questions, I will just thank you all for joining me, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Art in Focus.